It was supposed to be a routine traffic stop, nothing out of the ordinary. The officer, confident and composed, approached the sleek black car with the air of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. His hand rested on his taser, his eyes narrowing at the man behind the wheel. A tall black man dressed in a plain button-up shirt, his demeanor calm, but his expression hinted at the weariness of someone who had seen this script play out too many times. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone sharp, leaving no room for questions. The man complied, reaching slowly into the glove compartment, his movements measured. "Here you go, officer," he said with quiet politeness, his voice steady but carrying the weight of someone trying to avoid escalation. The officer barely glanced at the documents before stepping back and tapping his radio. "We've got a possible suspect here," he muttered, loud enough for the man to hear. "Might be a stolen vehicle. Stay on standby." The man frowned, his lips pressing into a thin line. "This is my car," he said firmly. "I can confirm that if you check the registration." But the officer wasn't interested in explanations. He gestured for the man to step out of the vehicle, his hand now fully gripping the taser. "Out of the car. Now." The tension rose like a thick fog, suffocating the air around them. A few passers-by slowed their pace, sensing something wasn't right, their curious glances darting toward the scene. The man opened the door and stepped out cautiously, his hands visible, his posture non-threatening. "What seems to be the problem, officer?" he asked again, his voice holding an edge of frustration now. "You match the description of someone we're looking for," the officer snapped, circling him like a predator. Arms out, feet apart. The man's brow furrowed, a mixture of confusion and indignation flashing across his face. "Description? What description? I've done nothing wrong." "I'll decide that," the officer shot back, pulling out his taser. "Turn around." It was humiliating. The man's pulse quickened as he complied, his mind racing. He wasn't just any civilian, his position, his authority, his accomplishments, all of it was being disregarded in this moment. He stood there, arms raised, as the officer patted him down with unnecessary force, his words dripping with disdain. "Looks like another one who thinks he's above the law," the officer muttered under his breath, but loud enough to sting. "Officer, I need you to listen to me," the man started, his voice firm but controlled. "You're making a mistake." The officer scoffed. "The only mistake I see is you thinking you can talk your way out of this." And then it happened. Without warning, the officer pulled the trigger on the taser. A sharp crack filled the air as the electricity coursed through the man's body, forcing him to his knees. Gasps erupted from the small crowd that had gathered. The humiliation was complete, stripped of dignity, reduced to nothing more than a suspect in the eyes of this man who hadn't bothered to look past his own biases. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The man looked up from the ground, his breathing labored, his eyes locking onto the officer's. There was no rage, no pleading, just a quiet, unyielding defiance. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of a tidal wave. The officer smirked, oblivious. "I don't care who you are. You're just another one of them." The scene crackled with tension, the officer unaware of the storm he had just unleashed. The man staggered to his feet, brushing off the dirt from his pants, his gaze unwavering. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But what happened next would turn the entire department, the city, and even the nation on its head. What this officer didn't know was that his arrogance, his prejudice, his blind abuse of power, had just set in motion a reckoning he could never have anticipated. Who was this man that he had so carelessly humiliated? Why did the simple words, "Do you know who I am," seem to carry a weight that shook those who heard them? And how would the fallout from this encounter ripple through the lives of everyone involved? Stay with us as we unravel a story of justice, accountability, and a reckoning that left everyone stunned. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. To every black viewer watching this, know that your value is immeasurable, your voice matters, and your experiences deserve to be respected and heard. This channel is a safe space, and we are committed to sharing stories that inspire justice, dignity, and understanding. We hope you enjoy today's gripping story of resilience and accountability. If you like what you see, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and join our growing community. Now, let's dive into the story. The morning was like any other in the city of Charleston, South Carolina. The humid air carried the scent of magnolia trees, and the streets bustled with the familiar rhythm of commuters navigating their way to work. At first glance, the city seemed peaceful, thriving even, with its historic charm and vibrant community. But beneath the surface, unspoken tension simmered, waiting for a spark. At the center of this story was Marcus Hayes, a man who had spent his life defying expectations. Tall, with a commanding presence and sharp features, Marcus carried himself with a quiet confidence. His deep brown eyes were a window to years of hard work, resilience, and a steadfast commitment to justice. Born and raised in a modest neighborhood on Charleston's west side, Marcus had grown up watching his parents struggle to make ends meet. His father, a factory worker, and his mother, a nurse, instilled in him the values of perseverance and integrity. They had always told him that the world wouldn't be kind, but it was up to him to rise above it. Marcus did just that. From an early age, he excelled in academics, driven by an unshakable belief that education was his way out of the systemic barriers that held so many back. He attended Howard University on a full scholarship, graduating at the top of his class in criminal justice. After completing his degree, Marcus joined the Charleston Police Department, determined to make a difference from the inside. Over the years, he rose through the ranks, earning the respect of his peers and the community. Now, at 42, Marcus had just been appointed as the chief of police, the first black man in Charleston's history to hold the position. It was a monumental achievement, but it came with its own set of challenges. Not everyone was thrilled about his appointment, and Marcus was no stranger to the subtle, and sometimes overt, resistance he faced within the department. On the other side of the story was Officer Daniel Cooper. Daniel was in his mid-30s, with a rugged jawline and a demeanor that alternated between cocky and aloof. Born into a family of law enforcement, he had always seen the badge as a symbol of power rather than service. His father and grandfather were both police officers, and their legacy loomed large over him. While Daniel wasn't outright cruel, his worldview was shaped by years of privilege and a narrow understanding of what justice truly meant. He often made assumptions about people based on their appearance, a habit that had gone unchecked throughout his career. Daniel's record wasn't spotless. There were complaints of excessive force and racial profiling, but they were swept under the rug, dismissed as misunderstandings or necessary actions. That day, Marcus decided to drive himself to the precinct. He liked the anonymity of being out of uniform, blending in as just another citizen. His dark gray sedan was unassuming, and his attire, a crisp white button-up and black slacks, gave no indication of his rank or status. He had a meeting scheduled to discuss new community outreach programs, a key initiative he hoped would rebuild trust between the department and Charleston's marginalized neighborhoods. Meanwhile, Daniel was stationed on a routine highway patrol. He was in a mood, irritated by what he perceived as another thankless day on the job. As he scanned the lanes of traffic, his eyes fell on Marcus's car. Something about it, perhaps the make and model, perhaps the driver's skin color, triggered an ingrained bias. Daniel decided to pull the car over. Marcus noticed the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. A knot of frustration tightened in his chest, but he pulled over calmly, already anticipating the interaction. He had experienced this kind of scrutiny before, even as a high-ranking officer. As Daniel approached the vehicle, Marcus rolled down his window, his expression neutral. Daniel's initial tone was curt, almost dismissive, as he asked for Marcus's license and registration. Marcus handed them over without protest, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Daniel barely glanced at the documents before stepping back and calling for backup, muttering something about a potential stolen vehicle. Marcus, now leaning against the steering wheel, could feel the familiar sting of injustice rising. This wasn't new, but it didn't make it any less infuriating. When Daniel returned, his demeanor was even more abrasive. He ordered Marcus out of the car without explanation, ignoring the man's attempts to clarify the situation. Marcus complied, stepping out slowly and keeping his hands visible. He didn't want to escalate things, but there was only so much patience he could muster. Daniel began a rough pat-down, his actions unnecessarily forceful. Marcus gritted his teeth but said nothing, his mind racing with thoughts of what this scene would look like to an onlooker. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, the chief of police, subjected to the same dehumanizing treatment he had spent his career trying to eradicate. The situation reached its boiling point when Marcus tried to speak. "Officer, you're making a mistake. If you just check." "Quiet," Daniel snapped, cutting him off. "I don't need a lecture." At that moment, something shifted in Marcus's expression. It wasn't anger or fear but a calm, resolute determination. He realized Daniel had no idea who he was, and he wasn't going to offer the information willingly. This wasn't just about him, it was about the countless others who didn't have the luxury of rank or title to shield them. What Daniel couldn't see, what he wouldn't see, was that his actions were being noticed. By the small crowd forming near the highway, by the dashcam recording everything, and by the unseen forces of accountability that were about to crash down on him like a tidal wave. As Marcus stood there, enduring the humiliation, he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The air inside the precinct was heavy with tension. Officer Daniel Cooper strode in with the swagger of someone who believed he had done everything by the book. He tossed his radio onto his desk, exchanged a few casual words with his colleagues, and carried on as if the incident on the highway had been nothing more than a minor blip in his day. The adrenaline that had fueled his actions earlier had now settled into a smug satisfaction. He felt justified, untouchable even. After all, in his mind, he was just doing his job. In the holding room, Marcus Hayes sat quietly, his posture erect and his expression unreadable. His white shirt was slightly wrinkled, a subtle testament to the unnecessary roughness he had endured. His mind wasn't racing, it was focused, methodical. He was piecing together the next steps, deciding how to approach a situation that had spiraled far beyond reason. He hadn't revealed his identity yet, not out of fear, but out of a deliberate choice. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the systemic rot he had sworn to address from the moment he pinned the badge to his chest. Outside the room, the small crowd that had witnessed the incident on the highway was beginning to grow restless. A young woman who had filmed everything on her phone whispered urgently to another bystander. They debated whether to share the footage online immediately or wait until they knew more about the man who had been detained. The whispers carried a simmering indignation, a collective unease that something deeply wrong had just taken place. Inside, Daniel's partner, Officer Miller, approached him cautiously. Miller was younger, fresh out of the academy, and still had the idealistic spark that many officers lost over time. He had been present at the scene but hadn't intervened, a decision he was now starting to regret. He leaned against the edge of Daniel's desk, lowering his voice to avoid drawing attention. "Hey, about earlier," Miller began, hesitating slightly. "Are you sure everything was necessary? I mean, the guy didn't seem like much of a threat." Daniel shot him a look, the kind that immediately silenced dissent. "You don't second-guess me, rookie. That's how you lose control out there. Trust me, I've been doing this long enough to know who's trouble and who isn't." "But," Miller started again, only to be cut off. "No buts. I don't have time for bleeding hearts. If you can't handle the job, maybe you're in the wrong line of work," Daniel said, his voice sharp, dismissive. Miller fell silent, but the doubt lingered in his eyes. He glanced toward the holding room where Marcus sat, his curiosity growing. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with him, but he wasn't sure how to act on it without jeopardizing his own position. Meanwhile, Marcus remained calm, though the atmosphere in the precinct was palpable. The subtle glances from officers passing by, the hushed conversations, it all hinted at a tension that no one wanted to acknowledge outright. He noticed Miller's hesitant gaze through the small window in the door and gave a barely perceptible nod. It was enough to make the young officer pause, his brow furrowing as he debated whether to push further. In the break room, a sergeant named Torres was scrolling through his phone when he stumbled upon a post. The video from the highway had already started making rounds online, and it was gaining traction fast. The shaky footage captured every detail, Daniel's dismissive tone, the excessive use of force, and Marcus's restrained demeanor. Torres's stomach sank as he watched. He knew trouble when he saw it, and this was a storm waiting to erupt. He rushed to the captain's office, where Captain Green was reviewing case files. Green was an older man, nearing retirement, with a no-nonsense attitude. Torres entered without knocking, his face pale. "Captain, we've got a problem," Torres said, handing over the phone. Green watched the video in silence, his jaw tightening with each passing second. When it ended, he let out a long breath, placing the phone on his desk. "Who's the officer in this video?" "Cooper," Torres replied. "But, Captain, there's something else. The guy he detained." "I think don't say it," Green interrupted, rubbing his temples. "Don't say what I think you're about to say." Torres nodded grimly. "It's Chief Hayes." The room fell silent. Green stared at the phone as if it might offer an alternative explanation, but the evidence was irrefutable. He rose from his chair, his movements deliberate. "Does Cooper know?" "Not yet," Torres said. "What do you want to do?" Green didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the holding room. When he opened the door, Marcus looked up, meeting his gaze with calm authority. Green didn't need confirmation. He already knew the truth. "Chief," Green began, his voice low but steady. "I'm so sorry about this. I had no idea." Marcus stood slowly, smoothing out his shirt. "What happens next will determine how sorry you really are." Green nodded, his expression grim. He stepped out of the room, leaving Marcus alone once more. Outside, the precinct was beginning to buzz with whispers as news of the video spread among the officers. Daniel, still oblivious to the growing storm, was chatting loudly with another officer, cracking jokes about the suspect he had detained. The young woman who had filmed the video arrived at the precinct, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She demanded to speak to someone in charge, her voice carrying the righteous anger of someone who refused to be ignored. Torres intercepted her, leading her to a quiet corner where she could explain what she had witnessed. Her words added weight to the already damning evidence, painting a picture of an officer who had acted not out of duty but prejudice. Back at his desk, Daniel finally noticed the shift in atmosphere. The usual hum of the precinct had turned into a low murmur, punctuated by glances in his direction. He frowned, his confidence beginning to waver. Miller approached him again, this time with a different energy. "Cooper," Miller said, his voice firm. "I think you need to see something." "What now?" Daniel replied, irritation creeping into his tone. Miller handed him a phone with the video playing. As Daniel watched, the color drained from his face. He recognized the man in the footage, but it wasn't the identity that struck him first, it was the realization that his actions were now on display for the world to judge. Daniel looked up, his mouth dry. "Who is he?" Miller hesitated before answering. "He's the chief of police." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Daniel's expression shifted from disbelief to panic, and for the first time, the weight of his actions began to sink in. But what he didn't know was that this was only the beginning. The full consequences of his choices were yet to unfold, and they would leave an indelible mark on everyone involved. The precinct was buzzing with a nervous energy that felt almost tangible, like a storm brewing just below the surface. The video had spread faster than anyone could have anticipated, and its implications were finally hitting home. Officers whispered in small groups, their glances darting between the holding room and the desks where supervisors were huddled in tense discussions. It wasn't just about the actions of one officer anymore, it was about what this meant for the department as a whole. Inside the holding room, Marcus Hayes remained composed, but there was a weight behind his calm exterior. He knew the moment of reckoning was near. He'd kept silent long enough, allowing the situation to unravel naturally. Now, the pieces were falling into place, and he was ready to confront the man who had so carelessly assumed he had the right to strip him of his dignity. The door opened, and Captain Green stepped in, his face lined with worry. "They're waiting for you, Chief," Green said, his voice low, almost apologetic. Marcus stood, smoothing his shirt as if to erase the wrinkles that had no business being there. His steps were deliberate as he followed Green out into the main area of the precinct. The room seemed to shift as he entered, conversations fading into silence. Officers avoided his gaze, some out of shame, others out of fear. Marcus's presence was commanding, a stark contrast to the man who had been unjustly detained just hours earlier. Daniel Cooper stood by his desk, visibly uneasy. His earlier confidence had been replaced by an anxious energy that made him fidget with his hands. He glanced up as Marcus approached, his eyes narrowing in confusion before realization struck. It was written all over his face, the dawning horror of understanding who Marcus truly was. Daniel's mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. Marcus stopped a few feet away, his gaze steady, unwavering. For a moment, the room was so silent that the faint hum of the air conditioning could be heard. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried an authority that left no room for interruption. "Officer Cooper," Marcus began, letting the name hang in the air. "Do you recognize me now?" Daniel blinked, his throat dry. I didn't," he stammered, but Marcus raised a hand to silence him. "You didn't what?" Marcus pressed, his tone sharp but measured. "You didn't bother to check the registration? You didn't listen when I tried to explain? Or you didn't care because, in your mind, I fit a narrative you've told yourself so many times it feels like the truth?" Daniel's face flushed, and he glanced around the room, searching for support that wasn't there. His fellow officers avoided his gaze, their silence louder than any condemnation. He took a shaky breath, trying to regain some semblance of control. "I thought I was doing my job," Daniel said finally, his voice defensive but weak. "You didn't identify yourself." Marcus's eyes narrowed, the faintest trace of incredulity flickering across his face. "So it's my fault, then? My fault that you jumped to conclusions? My fault that you used unnecessary force on someone who wasn't resisting, wasn't a threat?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Marcus's words. "It wasn't personal," he muttered, though the words rang hollow. Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, deliberate tone that carried across the room. "Not personal. You humiliated me. You humiliated yourself. And you've humiliated this department with your reckless actions. This isn't just about me, Officer Cooper. This is about every person who looks like me and has to live with the fear that someone like you will decide their worth based on nothing but the color of their skin." The room seemed to hold its breath as Marcus's words settled over them. Daniel's shoulders sagged, his defenses crumbling entirely. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "No," Marcus replied, his voice steady but cutting. "You didn't want to know. And that's the problem." Captain Green cleared his throat, stepping forward to address the room. His voice was firm, but there was a weight to it, as though he carried the burden of the department's failings on his shoulders. "Effective immediately, Officer Cooper is suspended without pay pending a full investigation. This department does not and will not tolerate behavior that undermines the trust of the community we are sworn to serve." The words hung in the air, their finality sinking in. Marcus's expression didn't waver, but there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes, not satisfaction, but the quiet resolve of someone who knew this was just one step in a longer journey. As Daniel was escorted from the room, his head down and his confidence shattered, Marcus turned to address the rest of the precinct. His voice carried the same calm authority that had marked his earlier words, but now there was a note of determination, a call to action. "This isn't just about one officer," Marcus said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "This is about a culture that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. Change doesn't come from apologies or punishments alone. It comes from accountability, from reflection, from commitment. And I intend to hold every single one of us accountable, starting with myself." The room remained silent, but there was a shift in the air, a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed. Marcus turned and walked toward his office, the weight of the day evident in his measured steps. As the door closed behind him, the precinct buzzed with murmured conversations, officers grappling with the fallout of what had just unfolded. In his office, Marcus sat down, his gaze falling on the stack of papers on his desk. They were proposals for community outreach programs, initiatives he had hoped would bridge the gap between the department and the people it served. Today's events had made it clear just how much work there was to do, but Marcus wasn't deterred. If anything, he was more determined than ever to see it through. Outside, the city was already reacting. The video had gone viral, sparking debates, protests, and conversations that were long overdue. And while the storm was far from over, one thing was certain: the actions of one man had set in motion a chain of events that would change the department, and perhaps the city, for good. The precinct hadn't quieted. Even after Daniel Cooper had been escorted out and the immediate crisis seemed contained, the air was still heavy with unease. Officers spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward Marcus Hayes's office, where the blinds were drawn shut. The tension wasn't just about what had happened to Cooper, it was about what it meant for everyone. For some, it was an overdue reckoning. For others, it was a chilling reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control. Inside the office, Marcus sat at his desk, his posture upright, his expression unreadable. In front of him, a folder lay open, filled with reports and complaints tied to Daniel Cooper's record. There were more than a few. Excessive force. Unnecessary stops. Complaints from citizens that had been brushed aside with flimsy excuses or technicalities. Marcus stared at the papers, the weight of them pressing down on him, not just because of what they revealed about Cooper, but because they reflected a larger problem, one that had been allowed to fester for far too long. A knock at the door broke his focus. It was firm but hesitant, the kind that conveyed both urgency and apprehension. Marcus leaned back in his chair, letting the tension stretch for a moment before responding. "Come in." The door opened, and Officer Miller stepped inside, his hat held tightly in his hands. He looked younger than he had earlier, almost boyish, his unease written all over his face. Marcus gestured for him to sit, but Miller hesitated, standing awkwardly near the door. "Sir, I just wanted to say," Miller started, his voice faltering. He took a deep breath and tried again. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. For not stepping in. For not doing more. I saw what was happening, and I froze." Marcus studied him, his gaze steady but not unkind. "And why do you think you froze?" he asked, his tone measured. Miller hesitated, his grip on his hat tightening. "Because I was afraid," he admitted, the words heavy. Not of the situation, but of what it would mean. Speaking out against another officer, it's not easy, sir. I didn't know how it would play out, and I didn't want to make things worse. Marcus leaned forward, his hands resting on the desk. "Officer Miller, fear is natural. It's a part of this job, and anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. But what you do with that fear, that's what defines you. Standing by when you know something is wrong isn't neutral. It's complicity. You understand that, don't you?" Miller nodded slowly, his head bowed. "Yes, sir. I do. And I want to do better. I just I don't know where to start. Marcus regarded him for a moment, then nodded. Acknowledging the problem is a start. But it's not enough. You have to act. You have to make a choice every day to uphold the values you swore to protect, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Miller looked up, a flicker of determination in his eyes. I will, sir. I won't let this happen again. Marcus leaned back, his gaze softening slightly. Good. Because the work we have ahead of us isn't easy. But it's necessary. And it starts with people like you. Miller nodded, standing a little straighter. Thank you, sir. For giving me a chance to make it right. As Miller left the office, Marcus let out a slow breath. He wanted to believe the young officer's sincerity, but he'd seen too much to take words at face value. Change wasn't about promises, it was about action. And that was a lesson he intended to make clear to everyone under his command. Another knock came, this one sharper, more insistent. Marcus called for the person to enter, and Captain Green stepped in, his expression grim. We've got a situation, Green said without preamble. The video's gone national. The mayor's office is involved, and the media's swarming. They want a statement. Marcus nodded, unsurprised. And what do you think we should say? Green hesitated, then sighed. The usual. That the matter is under investigation. That we take these incidents seriously. The standard line. Marcus's jaw tightened. And how far has that standard line gotten us, Captain? How many more videos do we need before we realize that words aren't enough? Green frowned, his discomfort evident. I get it, Marcus. I do. But this is bigger than us now. The mayor's worried about the department's image. About public trust. Marcus rose from his seat, his voice firm but calm. Public trust isn't built on image, Green. It's built on accountability. And if the mayor can't see that, then maybe it's time for him to rethink his priorities. Green shook his head, exhaling sharply. You're putting a target on your back, you know that. Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. I'm used to it. The captain nodded reluctantly, then turned to leave. Marcus watched him go, the weight of the moment settling over him once again. He knew the road ahead would be treacherous, but he wasn't deterred. If anything, the stakes only strengthened his resolve. The day wore on, and the precinct remained a hive of activity. Reporters crowded outside, their cameras trained on the building, while officers inside grappled with the fallout. Marcus moved through it all with quiet determination, speaking to community leaders, addressing his team, and preparing for the press conference that loomed ahead. When the time finally came, Marcus stepped out into the glare of the cameras, the crowd's murmurs falling silent as he approached the podium. He stood tall, his voice steady as he addressed the city. What happened yesterday was unacceptable, Marcus began, his words deliberate, his tone resolute. Not just because of the actions of one officer, but because of what it represents. A failure to uphold the values we swear to protect. A failure to see each other as equals. A failure to recognize our shared humanity. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Accountability is not a punishment. It's a promise. A promise to do better. A promise to hold ourselves to the standards we expect from others. And that promise starts here. Today. The crowd erupted in questions, but Marcus remained composed, answering each with the same unwavering clarity. By the time he stepped away from the podium, the narrative had shifted. It was no longer just about the video or Daniel Cooper, it was about a system that needed to change. And Marcus Hayes was determined to lead that change, no matter the cost. The fallout of the incident rippled through the precinct like an unstoppable tide. Conversations that had been whispered behind closed doors were now being spoken openly in the hallways. Officers who had previously turned a blind eye to similar behaviors were beginning to question their silence. The atmosphere was tense, not just because of what had happened but because of what it represented, a reckoning with a culture many had grown comfortable ignoring. Marcus Hayes sat in his office, his fingers steepled as he stared out the window. The city stretched before him, vibrant and restless, but his focus wasn't on the skyline. He was replaying the events of the day in his mind, analyzing every detail, every word spoken. The weight of what had transpired wasn't lost on him. He knew this was more than just a personal vindication. It was an opportunity to address the systemic issues that had plagued the department for decades. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Captain Green stepped in, his expression a mixture of concern and resolve. He closed the door behind him, his movements careful, as if the room itself held the tension of the day's events. "Chief," Green began, his voice hesitant. "We've been contacted by the mayor's office. They want a statement, something to reassure the public that we're taking this seriously." Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the window. "And what do you think we should say, Captain?" Green hesitated, clearly measuring his words. "We need to address the incident head-on, acknowledge what happened, and outline the steps we're taking to ensure it doesn't happen again. But we also need to be careful. There's a lot of scrutiny right now, and any misstep could escalate things further." Marcus turned to face him, his expression calm but firm. "Careful isn't what we need right now. Honest is. The public doesn't want platitudes, and neither do I. This isn't just about saving face, Captain. It's about restoring trust we've lost because we let things like this happen." Green sighed, nodding. "You're right, of course. But there's another issue. Cooper has filed a complaint. He's claiming he was unfairly targeted after the fact because of your position." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Marcus simply stared at Green, his expression unreadable. Then he let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Unfairly targeted. That's rich, coming from him." Green shifted uncomfortably. "I know it's absurd, but it's gaining some traction. A few of his supporters are trying to spin this as a case of overreach, saying you used your authority to punish him personally." Marcus's eyes narrowed, a flicker of anger breaking through his calm exterior. "This isn't personal. It's about accountability. If people can't see that, then maybe we're not being clear enough about our intentions." Outside the office, the precinct was in a state of flux. Officer Miller sat at his desk, replaying the events of the day in his mind. He had seen the video, watched as Cooper's actions were laid bare for everyone to judge. He couldn't shake the look in Marcus's eyes during the confrontation, the calm resolve of a man who had been forced to endure something he shouldn't have had to. Miller had always prided himself on being fair, but now he was questioning whether his silence in moments like these had made him complicit. He glanced over at Torres, who was speaking in low tones with another officer. The tension in their voices was clear, but Miller couldn't make out the words. Finally, he stood and approached them, his heart pounding. "Torres," he began, his voice steady but carrying a hint of urgency. "What happens next? Are we just going to move on like this didn't happen?" Torres looked at him, his expression grim. "You think this is something we can just move on from? Trust me, Miller, this isn't going away anytime soon. The chiefs made that clear." "But what about Cooper?" Miller pressed. "He's trying to spin this like he's the victim. Doesn't that bother you?" Torres let out a heavy sigh. "Of course it does. But what can we do? The process has to play out. And if Cooper's got people backing him, it's going to get messy." Miller shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "It's already messy. That doesn't mean we just sit back and let him twist the narrative." Meanwhile, Marcus was preparing for a press conference. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras trained on the podium where he would soon speak. The video had reached millions by now, sparking protests and demands for reform. Marcus knew the stakes were high, but he also knew this was a moment he couldn't afford to squander. When he stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. He took a moment to scan the crowd, his gaze steady, before he began. Good evening. Today, an incident occurred that has brought to light issues we can no longer ignore. An officer in this department acted in a way that was not only unprofessional but also deeply damaging to the trust we are supposed to uphold with the community we serve. I am that community, as are all of you. And today, I was reminded of just how far we still have to go. His words were measured, deliberate, each one landing with the weight of truth. He didn't shy away from the details, recounting the events of the day with clarity and honesty. He spoke not just as the chief of police but as a man who had experienced the very injustices he was working to dismantle. As he finished, the room erupted in questions, reporters shouting over one another. Marcus raised a hand, quieting them. This isn't just about one officer or one incident. It's about a system that has allowed these behaviors to persist for too long. Change isn't easy, and it won't happen overnight. But I promise you this, as long as I am in this position, I will do everything in my power to ensure accountability, transparency, and justice. Not just for myself, but for every single person in this city. The press conference was a turning point, but it was far from the end. Back at the precinct, the officers watched the broadcast in silence, each of them grappling with their own thoughts. For some, it was a wake-up call. For others, it was a challenge to the status quo they had grown comfortable with. As the broadcast ended, Miller stood, his resolve firm. He knew what he had to do. The silence he had maintained for so long was no longer an option. It was time to speak up, to take a stand, no matter the consequences. He walked toward Marcus's office, each step a declaration of his intent. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear, the story wasn't over yet. The precinct was quieter than usual, the kind of silence that wasn't born from calm but from tension. Conversations that usually filled the air were subdued, spoken in hushed tones behind closed doors or exchanged through fleeting glances. The aftermath of the incident and the press conference loomed heavily, and every officer seemed to be carrying the weight of their own thoughts, their own complicity or indignation. For many, the events of the past day had been a mirror, forcing them to confront parts of themselves they'd been content to ignore. Marcus Hayes remained in his office, the door slightly ajar. Papers were spread across his desk, but his attention wasn't on them. Instead, his gaze rested on the framed photo of his parents, their faces filled with pride on the day he graduated from the academy. Their belief in him had been unwavering, a constant source of strength, but now he felt the added weight of their expectations. He had to get this right, not just for himself but for everyone who looked up to him, for everyone who saw him as a symbol of what was possible. A knock at the door broke the stillness, and Marcus turned to see Officer Miller standing there, his expression a mix of determination and hesitation. Marcus gestured for him to enter, and Miller stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He stood for a moment, gathering his thoughts, before speaking. "Chief, I need to talk to you," Miller began, his voice steady but tinged with unease. "About what happened?" "About everything." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying the younger officer. He could see the conflict in Miller's eyes, the struggle between wanting to do the right thing and fearing the repercussions. "Go on," Marcus said simply, his tone inviting but firm. Miller shifted his weight, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "I was there that day, on the highway. I saw how Cooper handled it, and I didn't do anything. I didn't stop him, and I didn't speak up. I just let it happen, and now I can't stop thinking about it." Marcus's expression didn't change, but there was a weight in his gaze that made Miller falter. He let the silence stretch for a moment before responding. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I can't keep quiet anymore," Miller admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "I joined this department because I believed in what it stood for. Because I wanted to make a difference. But somewhere along the way, I got scared. Scared of speaking up, scared of being labeled a problem. But after seeing what you went through, after watching that press conference, I realized I've been part of the problem. And I want to change that. Marcus considered his words carefully before responding. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, Miller. But courage isn't just about acknowledging your mistakes. It's about doing something to make it right. Are you prepared for that? Miller nodded, his jaw tightening with resolve. Yes, sir. Whatever it takes. Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. Good. Because change isn't going to come easy. There will be pushback, from inside and outside this department. But if you're serious about being part of the solution, then you're going to have to stand firm, even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it costs you. Miller met his gaze, and for the first time, Marcus saw a flicker of the idealism that had brought the young officer into the force. It was a start. As Miller left the office, Torres intercepted him in the hallway. The older officer's expression was unreadable, but there was a sharpness in his eyes. What did you say to him? Torres asked, his tone low but pointed. Miller straightened, his resolve unshaken. What I needed to say. Torres studied him for a moment before nodding slightly. Good. About time someone did. In another part of the precinct, Daniel Cooper was sitting in a small interview room, his hands resting on the table in front of him. His suspension had been swift, and he knew the investigation was just beginning. The walls felt like they were closing in, and for the first time in his career, he felt powerless. The smug confidence he had carried so easily was gone, replaced by a simmering mix of anger and fear. He didn't understand how things had spiraled so quickly, how he had gone from being in control to being the target. When the door opened, Marcus stepped inside, his presence filling the room. Cooper tensed, his jaw tightening as he avoided meeting Marcus's gaze. Marcus closed the door behind him, taking a seat across the table. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Marcus broke the silence, his voice calm but carrying an edge that cut through the tension. Do you understand why you're here? Cooper looked up, his eyes flashing with defiance. I was doing my job. You can spin it however you want, but I didn't do anything wrong. Marcus leaned forward, his gaze piercing. Your job is to serve and protect. Not to humiliate, not to assume, and certainly not to let your biases dictate your actions. You didn't just fail me that day, Cooper. You failed the oath you swore. And until you understand that, you'll never be anything more than a danger to the people you're supposed to protect. Cooper's lips pressed into a thin line, but Marcus wasn't finished. This isn't just about you. It's about every officer who thinks like you, who acts like you, and who believes they're untouchable. This department has to change, and it starts by holding people like you accountable. Cooper's defiance faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He didn't respond, and Marcus stood, his gaze unwavering. You have a choice, Cooper. You can take responsibility and learn from this, or you can continue to play the victim and let this define you. But either way, you're going to face the consequences of your actions. As Marcus left the room, Cooper slumped in his chair, the weight of his choices finally beginning to settle in. Outside, Marcus paused in the hallway, taking a deep breath. The battle was far from over, but he knew one thing for certain, change was coming, and he wouldn't stop until it did. The precinct felt different now, as if the air had shifted after Marcus Hayes' press conference. Officers moved through the halls with a kind of cautious quiet, their usual banter replaced by introspective silences. It wasn't just the incident or the public outcry that had changed things, it was the realization that Marcus wasn't just their chief, he was a mirror reflecting their own failings back at them. And that mirror wasn't going away. Marcus sat in his office, reviewing reports and statements. His desk was piled with papers, each one a fragment of the larger system he was working to reform. The events of the past few days had brought attention he hadn't sought but couldn't ignore. There were emails from community leaders offering support, messages from citizens demanding justice, and even a few from officers within his department expressing their unease with the way things had been handled. Marcus read them all carefully, filing away the words that might guide his next steps. A knock on his door broke his focus. He looked up to see Officer Miller standing hesitantly in the doorway, his hands clasped nervously in front of him. Marcus gestured for him to come in, and Miller stepped inside, closing the door behind him. There was a tension in the room, not hostile but heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. "Officer Miller," Marcus said, his tone neutral but inviting. "What can I do for you?" Miller hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "Sir, I've been thinking about what happened, about everything that's been happening. And I feel like I need to say something. Not just to you, but to myself too." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying the young officer with an expression of quiet curiosity. "Go on." Miller shifted his weight, his gaze flickering between Marcus and the floor. "I was there that day, with Cooper. I saw what he did. And I didn't stop it. I didn't say anything. I told myself it wasn't my place or that it wasn't my responsibility, but the truth is, I was scared. I was scared of what might happen if I spoke up. Scared of what people would think, or how it would affect my career. And now I can't stop thinking about how wrong that was." Marcus nodded slowly, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "It takes courage to admit that, Officer Miller. More courage than most people realize." Miller's voice grew firmer as he continued. "I don't want to be that person anymore, sir. I don't want to stand by and let things happen just because it's easier. I know I can't change what I did, or didn't do, but I want to be better. And I want to help make this department better too." For a moment, there was silence between them, the weight of Miller's confession hanging in the air. Then Marcus spoke, his tone thoughtful. "Change doesn't happen overnight, officer. It's a process, and it's not an easy one. But it starts with moments like this, with people like you who are willing to look at themselves honestly and decide to do better. The question is, are you ready to face what comes with that commitment? Because it's not just about words. It's about actions." Miller met Marcus's gaze, his own resolve clear. "Yes, sir. I'm ready." Marcus nodded again, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Good. Then let's get to work." Meanwhile, in another corner of the city, Daniel Cooper was sitting in his own version of purgatory. Suspended and under investigation, he had spent the past few days confined to his home, unable to escape the storm of backlash that had followed the release of the video. The media was relentless, dissecting every aspect of the incident in his career. Protesters had gathered outside his house, their chants echoing in his ears even when the crowd dispersed for the night. His phone buzzed constantly with messages, some from supporters, many from critics, but he had stopped checking them. He sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. His wife, Emily, was pacing the room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She had been supportive at first, defending him against what she called an overreaction. But as the days passed and the evidence piled up, her support had turned into quiet frustration. "You know," she said suddenly, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking about something. About why this happened." Daniel looked up at her, his eyes tired. "What are you talking about?" Emily stopped pacing and turned to face him. "You didn't know who he was. That's what you keep saying. But does it matter? Should it matter? What if he wasn't the chief of police? What if he was just some guy, some regular person? Would you have done anything differently?" Daniel stared at her, his jaw tightening. "I was doing my job, Emily. I followed protocol." "Did you?" she shot back, her voice rising. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you followed your own assumptions, not protocol. And now look where it's gotten you. Look where it's gotten us." Her words hit him harder than he expected, and for a moment, he couldn't respond. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but deep down, he knew she was right. The truth he had been avoiding was finally catching up to him, and it wasn't something he could outrun. At the precinct, the ripple effects of Marcus's press conference and the department's response continued to unfold. Officers who had once dismissed calls for reform were beginning to take notice, their own complicity gnawing at them in ways they hadn't anticipated. Community leaders were meeting with Marcus regularly, pushing for concrete changes and holding the department accountable for its promises. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in a while, there was a sense that progress was possible. In his office, Marcus sat with Captain Green and a few senior officers, discussing the next steps. The atmosphere was tense but productive, each person bringing their own perspective to the table. It was clear that not everyone agreed on the best path forward, but Marcus was determined to keep the focus on the bigger picture. "This isn't just about damage control," Marcus said, his voice firm. "It's about setting a new standard. We need to rebuild trust, not just with the community but within this department. And that starts with accountability, from the top down." Green nodded, though his expression was cautious. "I agree, but we also need to be realistic about what we can accomplish in the short term. People want results, and they want them now." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Then we give them results. Real ones, not just symbolic gestures. That means revisiting our policies, retraining our officers, and being transparent about everything we're doing. It's not going to be easy, but it's the only way." As the meeting continued, the seeds of change were being sown, each decision a step toward a future that was still uncertain but filled with potential. And through it all, Marcus remained resolute, knowing that the fight was far from over but also knowing that he wasn't alone in it anymore. The months following the incident brought a wave of transformation that no one in Charleston could have anticipated. The precinct was no longer the same. It had become a place where accountability was no longer just a word but a practice, and Marcus Hayes stood at the forefront of that change. His leadership was firm, his vision clear, and his resolve unshakable. He had turned a moment of humiliation into a catalyst for reform, proving that even in the face of injustice, dignity and purpose could prevail. Daniel Cooper, once confident and untouchable, faced the full consequences of his actions. The investigation into his conduct revealed not only the incident with Marcus but a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for years. He was stripped of his badge and faced a civil lawsuit that left him financially and emotionally drained. The community's outcry against him was loud and justified, but what truly broke him was the realization that his choices had destroyed the life he had built. His wife, Emily, eventually left, taking their children with her. Alone and ostracized, Daniel had no choice but to confront the man he had become. In a rare act of humility, he sent Marcus a letter, not an apology, but an acknowledgement of his wrongdoing. Marcus read it, folded it neatly, and placed it in his desk drawer. He didn't respond. Some lessons are meant to be learned in silence. Officer Miller found a new sense of purpose in the aftermath. His decision to speak out and support Marcus's reforms earned him the respect of his peers and the community. He became a key figure in the department's new training programs, focusing on de-escalation techniques and bias awareness. Miller's courage to face his own complicity and work toward change inspired others, proving that even within a flawed system, redemption was possible. His journey wasn't easy, but it was meaningful, and for the first time in his career, he felt like he was truly serving the people. Captain Green, who had once been skeptical of Marcus's methods, became one of his strongest allies. The two worked tirelessly to implement new policies and rebuild trust with the community. Their efforts were met with resistance at times, but the results spoke for themselves. Complaints of misconduct dropped, and community engagement increased. Green, who had been planning his retirement, decided to stay on a little longer, driven by a newfound belief in the potential for real change. As for Marcus, his journey was far from over, but he had found his footing as a leader. The road had been long and fraught with challenges, but he had never lost sight of his goal, to create a department that served its community with integrity and compassion. The support he received from the citizens of Charleston was overwhelming, and his story became a beacon of hope for other cities facing similar struggles. Marcus's personal life also saw a quiet transformation. He reconnected with old friends, spent more time with his family, and allowed himself moments of reflection and peace. His triumph wasn't just in his professional achievements but in his ability to remain true to himself through it all. The city itself had changed too. Protests that had once been fueled by anger and frustration evolved into organized movements advocating for systemic reform. Community leaders worked alongside the police to address long-standing issues, proving that collaboration was possible when trust was earned. The scars of the past were still there, but they were no longer the defining features of Charleston's story. Instead, the city became a symbol of what could happen when people refused to accept the status quo. In the end, Marcus stood in front of the precinct, looking out at a crowd that had gathered to celebrate the one-year anniversary of the reforms he had championed. There were speeches and cheers, but Marcus's moment of quiet reflection spoke louder than any words. He had come full circle, not as a man who had been defined by a moment of injustice but as a leader who had turned it into an opportunity for change. This story isn't just about Marcus Hayes or Daniel Cooper or even the city of Charleston. It's about all of us. It's about the choices we make every day, the ways we confront prejudice and injustice, and the courage it takes to hold ourselves and others accountable. It's about redemption and resilience, about the power of humility and the strength of integrity. What would you have done in Marcus's position? How would you have faced your own biases if you were Daniel? These are the questions we must ask ourselves if we want to be part of the solution. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it inspired you in any way, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist. There are so many more stories to tell, stories that challenge, surprise, and remind us of the complexities of the human experience. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.